All right, so today's lecture, or this particular lecture, because I might have another one, later today. So this particular one is going to teach you how to set up a debug um, app directory first, and then we'll talk a little bit about functions, basically subroutines, depending on which language they're called different names, but they're basically the same thing. And then we will talk about endpoints and also the express.js script. So I'll start to explain it in a little bit more details. And yes, I use another background music, kind of ambient music for this lecture. I'm keeping an eye on the volume of the background music, making sure that it's not overwhelming. So this should resemble a Fry's electronics shopping experience. Um, yeah, well, Fry's is no more, but we can still be agnostic and just kind of reproduce the same experience in this class. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. So I just signed into the Power Server, and this is my student account, so everything should be the same as your account. So when you first sign in, this is where you are in terms of the current working directory, because you'll be in your home working directory right now. And the first thing we want to do is to replicate the directory, and we want to copy everything into a new directory. So the command to do all the copying is called cp for copy. Yes, I know, saving 2 characters. Wow, that's a lot of saving. But that's what, people used to do when they were, working on computers, back in the 70s, because Unix is an operating system that was created in the 70s, and the people who created Unix are different from the people who created mainframe computers for IBM. So the philosophies are very different. Anyway, digression. So anyway, you use CP and then do a -R, which stands for recursive, which basically means I'm not just creating a directory, but I'm also recreating everything under the directory in a nested fashion. And then you specify where we are copying from. That is going to be Express. You don't have to do a slash here because we are copying the entire folder. And then the new folder is going to be express.debug. Okay, now that name is up to you. Okay, so if you just want to name it debug, hey, that's fine. But I'm going to use express.debug just to emphasize that that folder is for debugging purposes. And then you press the enter key, and it doesn't give you any feedback. There's no visual feedback whatsoever. So let's go ahead and check the new folder. So I'm going to do a cd to express.debug this time, and then press the enter key and do a ls. And actually, I'm going to do ls-a, because the funny thing is .port is what we call a hidden name. Any file name that starts with a dot in Unix or Linux is considered quote unquote hidden, which means a normal ls is not going to show it. ls-lowercase a, which stands for all, is going to show all the hidden files as well. So the first thing we want to do in this case is go to .port and then change the port number. So this time, it doesn't matter which port number you're assigned, just change the 412 to the 412 or 413. So this is what we want, because I just created another sequence of port numbers for debugging purposes. I'll explain what that means in just a little bit. And then save the file. Okay, I'm using Vim. For those of you who are using Nano, you should know how to save the file at this time. Control X will exit the editor, and it will confirm with you whether you want to save the file or not if you have not saved it yet. So I'm going to save it, and now we have a duplicate folder with a duplicate script and a different port number. It's very important to change the port number so it starts with 413 instead of 412, because otherwise the two Express apps will try to compete for the same port number, and that's not going to work. Alright, so I'm going to make some minor changes first to express.js in the debug folder, and I'm going to change my message just a little bit, and I'm going to say for debugging. So the other file, the other express.js, does not have this phrase for debugging. So this is something that I can use to differentiate between the two apps. So once again, save the file first, and now I can do a pm2 start express.js. And this time it might be helpful to name it, because otherwise it's just going to name this as express1 or something like that, because I already have one that's running as express. So I'm going to name this one as express.debug. Okay. Once again, how you want to name it is entirely up to you, but I'm just going to make it very clear that this particular app is for debugging purposes. Press the enter key, and you can see how I have a normal one running, and then I have the other one running as express.debug. The names are different and the IDs are different. So when you use PM2, you can identify using the ID, or you can identify using the name. I personally think the name is a little bit easier to use, but it's not a big deal. All right, so now the question is, what do I do with the debug version of the app? So the way you do it, or the way you use it, is you go to the browser, and let me open a new tab, and then we're going to do HTTPS. Don't forget, we have to use HTTPS. It is the secure version of HTTP. And we're going to type in express and then slash, and in my case, Aoyong T, and this time I'm going to include dot. Well, let's do it without the debug first. Okay, so this is the typical URL that you have used, currently. So I press the enter key, and not surprisingly, it just says hello world from tech. Okay, because this is from the previous, well, not exactly the previous one, but we have talked about this already in a previous video. So this one is not the debug version. And if I go back to the URL, and this time I append .debug after my name, now this time you do not have any options, okay? Because I have configured Apache to recognize your username .debug to be the debug version of your app. So this time when I press the enter key, it is showing the other app, okay? It's showing hello world from tech for debugging. So now the question is, why do I have both of these? Okay, so let me open up yet another tab, and I'm just gonna copy and paste the URL so that one has the debug and one does not have the debug. Alright, so this new one does not have a debug, and now we can show side by side. One is the quote-unquote production one, and the other one is quote-unquote the debug one. So let's talk about the rationale of doing all of this stuff here. Alright, so getting back to the terminal, and get back out to the root, or the home directory of your username. So now we have one folder which I say is for production. Now obviously in this class, so-called production is really just for me for grading purposes, and then the other one is for development. Okay, what I say here for debugging is really for development. So in real world, you're going to have to differentiate and be able to test both. Okay, so you're going to have a production one, that your customers and where your client is going to see it is stable, it is fairly bug free, and so on. And as you continue development, you're going to have a different presence on the URL, so that this way only you get to access that particular version for testing purposes. Because when you're testing, when you're developing, there are times that the script won't even start. So you don't want to mess around with the production one, because otherwise your client, may lose, the connectivity to your website, or worse yet, you might end up destroying data in the database. Once we get to database, you'll see why that might be a potential problem. So you want to separate the two instances as much as possible. And once, the way we do it here, on the Power Server, and since you have a student account, is the Express one is going to have port number 412 and then blah blah, and then the other one is going to have the port number of 413 blah blah. Okay, so when you turn in your homework, you're going to use Express. So that's where I'm going to go check, for the quote-unquote production code for homework assignment, which is fine. Okay, so the current assignment that is due on Monday, just keep it the way it is. But when I give you additional work to do and I'm still grading the previous one, then your new work is going to go to express.debug so that you can develop your code over there. Now, obviously, someone is going to ask, so what happens when I'm done with the development one and I say, okay, I'm ready to turn it in? You just have to copy express.js from your development folder into the production folder. That's all you need to do is to copy it. In industry, that is considered a fairly bad practice, because we are not using revision control. But since this class only has 4 units, we already need every single hour, every single minute, to talk about just web scripting concepts. So I don't think there's enough time for me to also cover how to use GitHub or revision control. So that being said, we are not going to use GitHub for this class. For those of you who are curious, and for those of you who want to kind of learn how to use GitHub on your own, feel free. Okay, it's not a problem. It's just that I will not be doing that in the lecture. All right. So what are we going to do now that we have a debug, okay, a development folder for our app? So the next thing I want to do is to take a look at Express first, as express.js, and I'll go ahead and explain a few things. And I'll turn on line numbers so it's easier to refer to each individual line. So the first line, use strict, is really just asking the interpreter, the Node.js interpreter, to go like, okay, I want you to warn me about things that is likely to lead to problems. That's what use strict is for. Obviously, that's a very non-technical definition of use strict. So if you go to Google and just search for Node.js use strict, one of the first few links will outline exactly what it does. Line 2 is module.paths.unshift, and then we have a string here. And once again, in JavaScript, single quote and double quotes are basically considered the same thing. What line 2 is really doing is to say, hey, when we're trying to when we're trying to find additional modules, go here too to try to find the modules. Because in Node.js, the so-called modules, you can look at it as libraries or basically it's code that somebody else has already written to serve a particular function. And we're going to use a lot of modules. Well, I wouldn't say a lot, but we're going to use some additional modules, especially for the database connection, database work, and a few other things. I have installed these into the system folder, which is /user/lib/node_modules. And if I don't do this particular line on line 2, Node.js does not know by default where to find those modules. So this line here is to inform Node.js where to find those additional modules. Line 3 is to give you FS, which is the file system module. It is built into Node.js, so this one does not require any installation. And we use that later on when we use this particular method from the file system. And the HTTPS is to handle HTTPS as a protocol, and so that includes both ways. It includes how to generate outgoing traffic using HTTPS, and also how to process the incoming traffic using HTTPS. Express is, well, you probably guess it. It's about the Express framework. I'll explain that further in just a little bit. So the line 6 is the first line, that creates an instance of the Express framework. So all it does is to refer to the name of the object that is representing the module, and using a function called protocol, which is the open and close parentheses. It is creating an instance, and that instance is now assigned to a variable. Well, it's not a variable, it is a constant because it starts with const. So it is assigned to a constant called app so that we can refer to this instance later on. This one, line 8, is a little bit easier to understand. fs is the object representing the file system module, and it has a method called read file sync. Now we're going to talk about sync versus async, maybe later on, because that's actually it's a pretty complicated topic in a certain sense, in a certain way. So we'll talk about that, in just a little bit. But what it does, if you look at this entire thing, all it does is to read the content of a file into, in this case, a constant. So the first argument that you're passing to that particular method is where do I find the file? The second one is how the file is encoded, because there are many different ways that content can be encoded. UTF-8 is basically ASCII, and that is the most common encoding scheme for text files. So this entire call on the right hand side of the assignment is just really reading the content from this file, and then it's going to create a constant called private key, which is on the left hand side of the assignment. So you can kind of look at private key as a quote-unquote variable, based on what we have already talked about, except it is a constant. So that means any further assignment to private key is going to create a runtime error, because Node.js knows that we are not supposed to change the value of private key. The next line, which is line 10, is doing about the same thing, but this time it's reading in the certificate. So between the private key and the certificate, this is what we need in order to establish an HTTPS connection, and that is part of what SSL, or Secure Socket Layer, is going to do. And on line 12, we are reading in the port number. So this time we are reading a .port file in the same folder as the script, and that's why you don't see all the slashes here, because we are specifying a path that is within the current folder. And the dot trim here is to remove any line feed or spaces before and after the content of the file, which is kind of needed in order to clean it up so that we have a clean port number. Alright, so up to this point, up to line 12, we're really just kind of setting up things. Line 14 is the line that starts to create an endpoint. So an endpoint is basically it's specifying a place, within the URL, so that we can say, okay, if the client, if a browser is requesting this particular path, this is how we're going to serve it. Okay, and we'll get back to the whole idea of a callback function in just a little bit. And then on line 21, this is how we establish the credential in order to start a HTTPS connection. And if I scroll down any further, on line 23, we are creating the HTTP server. So line 21 line 14 up to line 19, interestingly, does not actually start the server. All it does is to say, if the server is started, this is how we want to define the endpoints and how each endpoint is going to respond to an HTTPS request. Line 21 is creating an object. We talked about objects in Node.js already. It starts with a brace, ends with a brace, and then the content in between would have a name of the member and then the value of the member. And in this case, we have a second member called cert and the value being certificate. And that is needed. You can see how credential is used to create the HTTP server, because that is needed for the SSL standard to work. And we also need app here. So credentials is needed because of HTTPS, and then app is needed because it specifies all the endpoints and how we are supposed to handle each endpoint. And create server is going to use those two pieces of information in order to create an instance of an HTTPS server, which would listen to a particular port number. Guess which port we are listening to? It's listening to this port number here. Okay, and that's because when we start HTTP server to listen to the port number, we are passing port number, which is corresponding to what we have read from the file .port. So that basically outlines the basic skeletal script of Node.js. Now we're going to talk about functions. Okay, so we'll go ahead and create a function. Now, where you create a function really doesn't matter, because as a scripting language, you can define a function just about anywhere. You don't have to define a function first before you call or refer to the function. So a function in Node.js starts with a keyword function, and then you can give it an optional. You can give it a name. I said the name is optional, but in this case, it is not. Okay, so in this particular example, it is not optional because we have to somehow go back to refer to it. So we'll say test, okay, test URL, and then we use parentheses to include what we call the parameters. So it has two parameters, just like these two. Okay, now how you want to name the parameters is kind of up to you, but I would use REQ for request and RES for result. And then we use open curly brace. And the way I write the program is I always end the curly brace right away. So this way I don't forget to do it. And you can see how, in the case of Vim, it automatically indents, this much, which is way too much, compared to what I really want. So I'm going to say, tab stop equals to 2, which is, that's kind of what I want it to be. And it doesn't like it. I'll have to think about why it's doing this. Anyway, so in a subroutine, what we need to do, to create, a different endpoint that will give us a different message is simply to replicate what is on line 21 and line 22 right now. You can either type it or you can copy and paste it once you learn how to do that in Nano. Because I'm thinking very few people are going to use VI, so I'm not going to mention too much about VI. So in this case, because it's a test message only, so I'm going to use a paragraph element in HTML, and I'll just say that this is a test endpoint, and close the paragraph tag, and that's it for res write. So res write is referring to the parameter res, which is response. I earlier said result, which is incorrect. This is the response object that is passed to test URL from somewhere, and I will talk about who is passing it and who is triggering the execution of test URL in just a little bit. Okay, and then we have res.end, which basically says the response has ended at this point, and that's going to be our test URL. And now we're going to go create another endpoint. So to create an endpoint, you're going to say app dot, and depending on whether you have a post endpoint or a get endpoint, you can either say post or you can say get. So this time, get is the default unless you have a file that you might be transmitting to the endpoint, or you have some fairly complicated form data. Usually get is going to be okay. So when you use app.get, okay, the first thing you need to specify is where is the endpoint. So this time I'm going to specify an endpoint of test and then another slash here, and then comma. And the next thing we need to do is to give it a function which is called a callback function. And this time the callback function is just test URL, and we do not specify the parameters. So because test URL is already defined as a function, it has a name. So when we refer to test URL as the function to handle the endpoint of test, we just have to give it the name. So some of you may be asking, so how come on line 19 we got the parameters also specified? That is because from line 19, from here all the way up to here, that is creating a function on the fly without a name. This is called an anonymous function. And when you're creating a function on the fly, then you do have to use the keyword function. You have to specify the name of the parameters so that you can refer to the name of the parameter inside the body of the function. But this time on line 26, I'm not using the same method. I'm not using a anonymous function. I'm using an actual function that is defined from line 14 to line 18. And therefore, I don't use exactly the same syntax. I just have to say, hey, to handle the endpoint test, we are going to use function test URL. All right, so we are going to save the file and exit. There we go. And the first thing we want to do is to test it. Now, you might remember we have already started the process. So just because we have changed the file doesn't mean that it's going to be effective right away. To prove that point, I can now go back to the browser and go back to this one which has .debug. Okay, I'm just going to go back to go all the way to the end right there. So this is our debug folder. And if I refresh it, it's going to print the same thing. And if I even if I were now if I were to add test, okay, as the endpoint, it's going to be a problem because the script that is currently running, which is from the text file before I made all the changes, did not specify a test endpoint. So when I press that enter, it will just say cannot get test because the endpoint has not been specified in the file before I started the app. Okay, so this is good and bad in a way. Okay, it is good in the way that PM2 keeps the app running using the text file using express.js at the time that you start that you used PM2 to start the app. But if you make additional changes to express.js, it doesn't refresh automatically because that's not what we specified PM2 should do. And this is probably a better way to do it too, is to require you to manually restart the app once you have made changes. So now, if I go back to here, I can restart express.debug. So I say PM2 restart express.debug. At this time, I don't need to specify -- name because express.debug is the name of the app that we want to restart. Press the enter key, and it says right here, applying action restart process ID on app, and it checks, everything seems to be up and running. And if you are not sure whether you made a mistake and the app fails to start and whatnot, you can always do a PM2 and then a status to make sure that it is indeed online. You can even check how much memory it's using. It's using 44.5 megabytes right now. So to really check whether this is working or not, we have to go back to the browser. Okay, and I'm going to show you the entire path here. You can see that it is using allyoungT.debug/test/. So I am testing at the endpoint test, which I have just added to express.js. So I hit refresh again, and this time it shows this is a test endpoint, which means that the test endpoint is indeed working. All right, so now let's just say this is your assignment, okay, and you have just accomplished what your assignment is supposed to do, and I need to grade it, right? So what do? You go back here, okay, so all you have to do is to copy express.js to the production folder, because in this particular class we're going to put everything into just one single file. Until it's too much, then we'll go ahead and do something else. You can do one of two things. You can also use CP, but I wouldn't use CP because that's also going to copy .port, which is not what we want to do. So we're going to do a CP, just copy one single file, which is express.js, and now we have to specify the production folder. The production folder can be specified in a few ways. If you want to use the quote-unquote absolute path, then you can start with the tilde symbol, which is representing your home folder, and then the slash, and then express. You can do it this way. Or you can also use the other notation, which is a dot. So a dot basically specifies the parent folder. So once you get to the parent folder, which is actually just the home folder, you can then specify the subfolder name, which is express. So either way would work. Um, it's up to you to decide which one seems to make more sense to you. And I suspect that in FileZilla and also WinSCP, you can probably just drag and drop the file into the other folder too, and then it will give you a warning to say that a file already exists. Do you want to overwrite? CP does not give you any warning. It will just go ahead and overwrite the other file without giving you a warning. Okay, so let's just say that we do this, we do this, and then the next thing we need to do is to restart Express, because remember, Express is already running using express.js in the folder Express at the time that you say pm to start Express. So now we have to restart it. I'm not really sure whether we can restart it from here. I suspect so, so we'll give it a try, right? So pm to restart Express. And before we do that, it is best to test it first, right? So I'm going to go back to my browser and go all the way here. And this time I'm going to refer to the production URL, which is the one without the .debug, and try to test the endpoint called test. Press the enter key. This time we have an error because we have not restarted that app yet, even though we should have updated the express.js file. So now switch back to the command line and ask pm2 to restart. So there we go. And this particular symbol, I think it means the number of restarts for that particular app, which is pretty handy because you can see it was 1 and now it is 2, which kind of is a quick way to confirm that the restart was successful. So now we switch back to the browser and then hit the refresh over here, and we can see that now the production folder also can handle the test endpoint. So that's kind of the procedure. I will write this out, as in a document, just so that you have that as a written reference. But I would also suggest you guys to take your own notes, because the way I write things may not be intuitive to you. So the only way you can make sure that the notes make sense to you is to write it yourself. Okay, but I will write this down, just so that we have that process described. Um, so this is a very quick introduction to how we are going to handle the case of your tech needs one instance for testing and grading while you're working on the next homework assignment. So that is handled by Express for production, for me to grade, and express.debug as a separate folder so that you can continue development using express.debug. Two, the port numbers are different. Your production port number starts with 412, and then your debug or development port number starts with 413. And you also have to remember to restart the app once you have made changes to express.js. You have to say pm2 restart and then the name of the app, and you can get to the name using pm2 status. That's how you get to the name. And we also talked about the concept of a function. So a function is basically just a block of code that has a name, so we can refer to it. Well, it's a little more than that, but for the purposes of what we are doing, that's kind of how we are going to look at it. So I hope you guys will have a chance to kind of test out all the things that I have illustrated in this video. I'm going to work on the written document right away, and hopefully that will be done soon, and you guys can keep the written document for references. All right, I'm going to end this particular lecture right now. It's not too long, and more to come later. Okay, so we are just we are still setting up the whole thing. We are now setting up the production versus the development server, and then once we got everything set up, then we'll actually get into processing forms, generating lists, and so on. All right, cool. I am going to upload this and send the link to all of you.